Hello again. I'm amused to see parents worrying about their children spending too much time on the internet. This is a particular anxiety of some people during the lockdown when their children aren't at school. The fear is that they're spending all their time gawping at television or looking at unsuitable material on their mobile telephones and so on. And the worry is that it will harm their development or damage their minds or something. This is just the latest in a long line of wholly needless fears. Successive innovations in technology have always been viewed with suspicion by older people, especially in as far as they affect children and their studies. Socrates, and we're going back now 2,500 years, Socrates didn't like the idea of written works of science or philosophy. When children could read scrolls instead of memorizing poetry and history, he thought it meant that it would weaken their minds, that it would make them lazy and intellectually sluggish. It would have been better for them to learn these scrolls off by heart rather than be able to sit there just reading them. It was almost as though there's something cheating about it. The baby boomers, of course, have the same attitude, not having had access to calculators and the internet. They are now outraged at the thought of children not memorising a whole lot of things too, but rather having them available on tap, as it were. In the early 50s, children were compelled to learn the names of the royal houses of England, starting with Normandy and going all the way through to the Plantagenets and Tudors to Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. Now, any child wishing to know who followed the Normans need only glance at their smartphone, and there it is. To an awful lot of baby boomers, this smacks of laziness or cheating. Returning to this country and thinking about one of the things that people seem to be worried about is that their children won't be reading. If they're spending all their time looking at smartphones, that they'll become illiterate, and that when they go back to school they won't be able to read anymore. It's worth mentioning that the very idea of reading was seen as a dangerous innovation. Uh, you know, the reading of printed material, that is, in the early 16th century. One of the results of setting up printing presses in Britain, this was after William Caxton at the end of the 15th century, was that for the first time cheap printed material became available to ordinary people, including children. Some of this related to religious and scientific and educational matters, but an awful lot of it was designed to be pure entertainment. Among the most popular productions were things called chapbooks, and they were little leaflets, very poor quality, illustrated with crude woodcuts, and they contained ballads, songs, myths, and fairy tales, and of course a lot of smutty material as well, together with accounts of crimes and executions, sexual adventures. They were the forerunners of pornographic magazines, and a lot of those got into the hands of children. They found them more interesting than reading religious texts, as you can imagine. In 1528, William Tyndale, I'm sure some people know about William Tyndale, he was a religious reformer and he translated the Bible into English for the first time. He was really worried about the increasingly common practice of children reading printed material, that is. He wrote Robin Hood, Hampton, Hercules, Hector and Troilus, with 1,000 histories of fables of love and wantons and ribaldry, as filthy as heart can imagine to think, to corrupt the minds of youth. It's very difficult to imagine anybody today complaining strongly that their children are reading tales from Greek mythology. The new medium, though, in this case printed books, was clearly thought to pose a moral threat to youngsters, causing them to read filthy stories and so be corrupted. Fast forward 300 years to the late 18th and early 19th centuries, and we find serious concern being expressed about the habit of reading novels, which were now becoming widely available. This was believed to be particularly harmful to girls because not only did it lead to idleness, but it gave rise to an unhealthy interest in romance and sex. Experts warn that girls and young women became so absorbed in novels that they lost touch with the real world and were eventually unable to distinguish between fact and fiction. There's something curious here because these days parents are worried about their children sitting and gazing at their smartphones. The idea that seeing your children sitting there reading Robinson Crusoe would have been alarming makes us laugh, but it's just what parents do, it's what older people do. A new idea, whether it's chapbooks or novels or indeed just written words, it's frightening to older people. They think it's going to harm their children. As the 19th century drew on, a new menace to the psychological health of young people emerged, which was the penny dreadfuls. There's serialised stories in the forms of garish magazines, the adventures of highwaymen, supernatural thrillers, true crime, executions and so on. And on the covers were lurid, often gruesome illustrations. An enormous industry grew up to provide youngsters with a ready supply of this Victorian pulp fiction, and it was blamed for everything from the idleness of errand boys to rapes and murders which had taken place after youths had read them. There were demands for penny dreadfuls to be prohibited by law as they were responsible for so much misery. By the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, the penny dreadful scourge had faded away. At its height, youths charged with murders had actually blamed their crime on the reading of the penny dreadfuls, which had excited them to violence. The next menace to the mental stability of young people had emerged at the beginning of the 20th century, and it was also blamed for all manner of ills, from stealing cars to a decline in reading among children. This was the cinema, of course. In 1913, it was claimed that children's libraries in the city of Nottingham were seeing 50% fewer books being borrowed, and the reason, it was alleged, was that children were now spending all their spare time at the cinema and they no longer had any time to read. Then came worries about television, and then we had the video nasties, and now we've got the smartphones. All these things are part of the same general anxiety, and it's an anxiety of older people about what their children are doing and about new ideas, new technologies. So I suppose what I'm saying in effect is all those parents that are fretting because their children are gazing at their smartphones, they needn't really worry. In a few years' time they will dream of the days when the kids were looking at smartphones, because there'll be something new come along to worry about instead.